What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be brewing up one of my favorite styles of beer, the German Hefeweizen. It's an absolute classic, and it's one of those beers that's just a lot of fun to brew. But in today's video, I'm going to walk you through the entire process, step by step, detail by detail, so that you have everything that you need to know in order to be successful in brewing your own German-style Hefeweizen at home. Let's get started. German Hefeweizen is a delicious wheat beer. It's actually such a distinctive type of beer that it comes with its own type of glass. Those long, slender, bulbous Hefeweizen glasses are specifically made for this type of beer. It's a beautifully soft, delicate, balanced beer that has signature flavors of banana, clove, and vanilla, along with its wonderful base of wheat. This is one of those beers that I've brewed many times, and I have many different recipes for this particular type of beer. But if you're curious about making this particular one and you want to just jump to the recipe, it's going to be in the description box. There's also going to be a link to Brewfather where you can find the recipe there as well. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to Northern Brewer for providing the ingredients for this batch of beer, and also to Clawhammer Supply, who manufacture the system I'll be using to make it on. Even though I'm going to be using very specific ingredients and very specific equipment on this one, it does not necessarily mean that you need to use that exact stuff to make the beer. This is a very replicable beer, and it's something that you can make on your own in any system and with any generic wheat malt or Pilsner malt, and etc. We're going to talk through the alternatives as we go through the recipe. So last night I went ahead and collected about 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water. You don't need to use reverse osmosis water for this. I do believe it helps make a very predictable and consistent base for your water though. But if you want to just go to the store and buy some distilled water or some RO water from the store or some very clean spring water, it should be reasonably similar. Either way, the water profile I'm building today is basically a relatively low level of minerality to help keep the water soft, help keep the beer soft. It's going to have a slight bias towards the chloride level relative to the sulfate. And what that does is it helps the beer feel a little bit fuller, rounder, smoother, helps kind of make some of that sweeter wheat character come out, and it's going to be beneficial for this beer. So that water profile is going to be 42 parts per million of calcium, 3 parts per million of magnesium, 13 parts per million of sodium, 68 parts per million of chloride, 50 parts per million of sulfate, and 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. And in order to get that water profile, I'll be starting out, like I said, with 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water and adding to that 3 grams of calcium chloride, 1 gram of sodium chloride, 1 gram of Epsom, and 2 grams of gypsum. So now it's time to go ahead and mill the grain, and as I do that, I'm going to talk about the malts that are going to be going into this beer. This is a pretty simple grist, all things considered. There's only 3 types of malts in here, and realistically you only need 2 of them. So we're starting out with a base of 6 pounds of Weizen pale wheat malt. Wheat malt is really the core of a good Hefeweizen. This is where you're going to get obviously the characteristic wheat flavor, but also that high protein, the cloudiness, the silky mouthfeel. All of that goodness is going to come from wheat malt. One quick tip on wheat malt is you'll notice that these grains do not have a husk on them, and they're kind of smaller than barley kernels. And so therefore, sometimes if your mill has the ability to set a narrower gap, it's not a bad idea to do so, or go through and mill it twice. I haven't really had any issues doing this as a single run with the barley malt, but it's something you can do on your own if you wish to. We're going to be adding to this wheat malt 4 pounds of Weizen floor malted Bohemian Pilsner malt, which is an awesome, delicious Pilsner malt that I absolutely love. It's going to add a lot of nice flavor to this beer and help with the fermentability of things. And finally, to add a little bit of depth to the maltiness on this beer, I'm adding just about a 1/4 pound, 4 ounces of Weizen melanoidin malt. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these malts crushed up now. One thing of note, if you're using a brewing system that requires you to drain the wort out from underneath the mash tun into another vessel, or something like that, I highly recommend adding in a pound or 2 of rice hulls into your mash to help that process be a lot easier. In my case, because it's a brew in a basket style system, I don't have to worry about that. I just pull the grain out and let it drain through. It may take a while to drain through, but I can also scrape it out a little bit and work it that way if needed. But this is definitely something that I would recommend if you're going to be a 3-vessel or 2-vessel brewer. So I'm just going to go ahead and mash in now, adding in all of the grain into this water. We are all mashed in at 113 degrees. So we're gonna go ahead and let this sit for 10 minutes. And while I do that, I will talk through my plan for the mash. My plan is to do this as a traditional 3-step Hefeweizen mash. This is going to include one very important rest at a very low temperature, 113 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes. This particular rest temperature activates enzymes that release ferulic acid from the malts. This is an acid rest by any other name, but the ferulic acid is really important because any phenolic off-flavor positive or POF positive yeast, specifically Hefeweizen yeast though, is capable of converting this ferulic acid into a compound known as 4-vinyl guaiacol, or 4VG. This is the signature clove characteristic flavor that Hefeweizen is known for. Because this is a traditional German Hefeweizen, I'm including the ferulic acid rest. Because I want a balance of that clove and banana character. Depending on how much you like clove, you can either extend this rest or shorten or even eliminate the rest, and you'll have very different results for your beer depending on your yeast strain. Once that 10-minute rest is up, we will then step up to 146 Fahrenheit for a beta amylase rest for half an hour. This is where the majority of the fermentable sugars is going to be generated. The enzymes here are going to chop up the sugar into very short, small molecules known as maltose that are very easily fermented by the yeast. A half an hour rest at this temperature gets me plenty of fermentable sugars, and then after that we will step up to 158 degrees for another half an hour rest for an alpha amylase rest. This is where the beta amylase enzyme will be denatured, but the alpha amylase enzyme will be very happy and very active. The alpha amylase enzyme is going to cut starches up into longer chain sugars, more complex molecules that are not as easily fermentable by the yeast. This will generate body, mouthfeel, but also importantly, sugar complexity and flavor complexity. And then lastly, we'll round it all out with a quick mash out at 170 Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Not at all a necessary step. I just choose to do it more out of habit than anything else, but it's something that I think does kind of help drain the grain basket a bit easier. It helps make lautering a lot less painful, especially with a high percentage of wheat malts in here. I think that's a beneficial thing. Either way, I've programmed this into my Blickman Brew Commander, so I'm gonna come back in a little over an hour and we'll be ready to carry on to the boil. I'm sure some people will be wondering how I got the Blickman Brew Commander to work with the Clawhammer supply setup. The kettle plugs into the controller just like anything else. There is just one change you have to make. You just have to swap the thermowell out with a larger bore thermowell to accept the a little bit thicker Blickman sensor. It's an easy swap, and I'll link the product that I used on Amazon down below. Okay, the mash is complete now. So it is time to pull out the grain basket and we'll get started on the rest of the brew day. I've already set the controller to start heating up to a boil just to get a jump on things there, but we'll pop that up and see how well this will lauter. Seems to be going pretty well. We'll let this go until we get at least 7 gallons of wort, maybe a little bit more than that. I'm always okay with a little bit extra on there, but yeah, this thing is draining great. Smells great. All right, so we are now very close to the boil. So I kind of have a lot more liquid in here than I initially thought I was going to have, which is entirely due to the fact that I wasn't paying attention when I collected my water, and I collected an extra 3/4 of a gallon. So halfway through the mash, I compensated for that by adding in half a pound more of wheat malt and Pilsner malt. So I'm hoping we'll still hit the same general gravity. We'll see. But I have like 7 3/4, almost 8 gallons of wort in the kettle right now. So we might get more volume out of that, but that's still fine. Regardless, we are getting ready to get to the boil, so we're building up a really good hop break right now. I'm gonna start stirring that up a little bit, and then we'll start adding in some Firm Cap S, which is gonna help to break the surface tension on that and prevent any boilovers. So now that we've hit the boil, the first thing I'm gonna do here is actually sanitize the entire chilling system and the pump and the tubing and everything, just by simply running boiling wort through it. Okay, so now we have officially begun the boil. It's an hour-long boil, and I'm about to add in my first and only hop addition, which is this, which is 3/4 of an ounce, there we go, of 4.8% Tettnang. This is gonna go in at 60 minutes to give us about 13 IBUs overall. Hefeweizen is an incredibly malt-forward beer. It is not a hoppy beer at all. You really just want the bare minimum of hopping in there really to avoid any sort of infection, which is generally 8 to like 15 IBUs or so. Tettnang is really nice because it blends well with these flavors. It has a nice spicy characteristic that I personally really enjoy, and I think blends well into some of the yeast notes that we're gonna get out of this beer. So that's why I'm using Tettnang. You can use any German noble hop, to be completely honest with you. Generally anything you're gonna get bitterness out of is gonna be fine. So this is gonna go in now, and we're gonna let this continue for 1 hour. Normally at the 10-minute mark, I'd be adding in some Whirlfloc and some yeast nutrient and stuff like that. However, in this particular beer, I am skipping both of those things. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one, Whirlfloc is a clarifying agent, and Hefeweizen is not supposed to be a clear beer. If you're targeting a Kristallweizen, that's different. However, this is not going to be that kind of beer. I want this to be cloudy. I want the yeast to remain in suspension. I want there to be cloudiness in it. So Whirlfloc is counterproductive in that case. Secondly, yeast nutrients. Typically, I would be adding this in for fermentation health to accelerate the fermentation overall, and just in general to kind of give myself some cheap insurance that the fermentation will go well. In this case, a slight disadvantage to the yeast is not always a bad thing. It's a kind of a little bit of a fine line to ride, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail when it comes to the fermentation segment, but by slightly depriving your yeast of nutrients, by slightly under aerating, by slightly under pitching, you can generally get your expressive yeast strains, such as a Hefeweizen yeast, to kick out more flavor. Either way, I'm skipping the nutrient, I'm skipping the Whirlfloc, so we are going to circle back in an hour when this boil is totally done. All right, so the boil's now finished. It's time for us to start chilling in the kettle. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the heat here, turn on the pump, and then we'll turn on the chilling water here shortly. Basically though, I'm just gonna chill in my counterflow chiller, and we'll recirculate the chilled wort into the kettle. We'll gradually bring the kettle temperature down, and then we'll transfer that into my sanitized anvil bucket fermenter. So while I'm waiting for the wort to chill itself down fully, I'm gonna talk quickly about the yeast for today. That's gonna be this here. For the first time, I'll be using Fermentis Safale W68. This is the famous Weihenstephan 3068 strain, which is the same exact strain that pretty much every other yeast manufacturer out there uses as their standard Hefeweizen strain, or German wheat beer strain. That being said, this is the first time I've used this particular version of it. I'm very excited to see how this does. Theoretically, if it's a variant of the 3068 strain, it should be pretty predictable in what it does. And what I'm excited for, though, is the fact that it is a dry Hefeweizen strain. There's only one other out there that I really know of and have used in the past with great success, and that's Lallemand Munich Classic, which also makes a great Hefeweizen. Once this is fully chilled down, I'll go ahead and transfer into the bucket fermenter here. This is the widest, shallowest fermenter that I have at my disposal right now. That does matter when it comes to these weissbiers. Debatable whether or not it really matters on the homebrew scale. Okay, so the brew day is done now. It came out pretty solid with a higher than expected OG of 1054. Not surprising given that I kind of adapted on the fly there with a little bit of extra malt, but all things considered, not bad at all. So we'll just get this thing chilled down a little bit. This is gonna have a lower pitch temperature than my typical beers will, just because I wanna start it out kind of low and then bring it back up over time. So we're gonna try and get the wort down to about 62 degrees, which is not that far now at this point. All right, so everything's cooled off nicely now. It's down to about 62 degrees. So I'm gonna go ahead and pitch in my 1 packet of W68. And I'm gonna leave this to open ferment, and by open ferment, I really just mean not using an airlock. So we'll leave the bung in here with the open hole. I'll cover it up with a piece of tin foil. Now it's time to talk about the fermentation for this beer. Fermentation is one of the most important aspects of this particular beer. It's a yeast-driven flavor, so choosing your yeast in particular makes a big difference, and then how you treat your yeast, how you treat your fermentation also is gonna make a big difference. So real quickly, I'll talk about what my exact practice is gonna be for this brew, and then I'll walk you through some tips for success and some other things you can do, as well as some alternate yeast options. I'm gonna be pitching Fermentis W68, which is a dry Hefeweizen style yeast. I'm just gonna pitch a single packet into wort that is controlled at about 62 degrees Fahrenheit. This will also be an open fermentation. All I'm gonna do for an open fermentation is just put the bung in the port, but not put any airlock in the hole. So that way it is open to the atmosphere, but it's not so likely that bugs, dirt, something else will fall into the beer and otherwise contaminate it. We're gonna do an open fermentation at 62 degrees for the first 3 to 4 days. Once the fermentation's krausen starts to drop down a little bit, we will then close that fermentation by simply adding in an airlock. At that point, we will also begin to raise the temperature over the course of the next several days. I am targeting a total fermentation time for this beer of about 2 weeks, so we're gonna ramp from 62 to 75 over the course of the next 10 days. And that is going to hopefully promote a large amount of banana character and really get the beer to attenuate well. Once that fermentation is complete, I'm gonna go ahead and bottle the beer, and we'll just do this in a standard bottling process. I'm carbonating these to a high volume of CO2, about 3.2 calculated volumes of CO2 to get that characteristic high carbonation for this style. A couple tips for success when you're brewing Hefeweizen. Feel free to play around with the variables on this beer. There's generally a couple different ways you could attack the flavor of this beer. You could either make it very clove forward, like something like a Schneider Weiss, or you could go the complete opposite direction and go for an absolute banana bomb, something like your typical American style Hefeweizen. Or you could do what I love to do and I've done pretty consistently and just nail right in the middle. Get a little bit of both with a good balance. There really are many different drivers on this. If you want to increase the clove character, go ahead and extend that ferulic acid rest. You can also try to avoid bringing the temperature up too high during the fermentation, as this will help to favor those phenolics. If you want to go in the opposite direction and go for a very banana forward Hefeweizen, consider just eliminating the ferulic acid rest in general. Consider pitching a little bit less yeast and fermenting at a little bit higher of a temperature. That's always an option there. Or you could use one of those genetically modified Hefeweizen yeasts, such as Omega Bonanza. Unless you really know what you're doing and you've got a ton of reps on this type of beer style underneath your belt, I would actually advise against tweaking the pitch rate too much until you really have isolated that that's what you want to do. When it's done correctly, it can promote some of those increased esters, those increased banana and vanilla characteristics, but it also can throw a lot more nastiness as well. It's totally possible also to ferment this beer at a steady single temperature the entire time. I've done that plenty of times in the past, and it makes a perfectly fine Hefeweizen. If you want to do that, the choice of fermentation temperature does matter quite a bit. The warmer it is, the more isoamyl acetate it will create, which is that banana character. 65 to 70 degrees is about the Goldilocks zone for that stuff if you want to do a single temperature fermentation. One more tip for success here. It's a good idea to bottle condition these beers. It's totally fine to put them on tap. I've done it via keg many times, but it does clarify over time, and a lot of the character of this beer is from that yeast contribution. That's the reason why when you serve a Hefeweizen from the bottle, you swirl up that yeast and you'd pour it right on top of the rest of your beer. That creates a very particular flavor, which is core to these beers. So I do recommend bottle conditioning them if you have the time, the patience to do that. And now let's talk quickly about some alternative yeast strains out there. There's really not that many for Hefeweizen. Like, the standard is the Weizenstephaner 3068, which is what we are using today in the Fermentis form. So the Weizenstephaner 3068 strain is available not only as yeast 3068, but also W68 from Fermentis, which I'm using here, WLP 300 from White Labs, Imperial Stefan, and Omega OIL 021. I also believe, but I'm not 100% certain, that it is potentially Lallemand Munich Classic as well, for another dry yeast option if you can't find Fermentis W68. All of these, when used appropriately, should produce an excellent Hefeweizen. There are other wheat beer type strains out there, such as WBO6 or Belgian wheat strains. Keep in mind, these are very different beers. If you're trying to brew an authentic Hefeweizen, you should not be using those because they will dry your beer out significantly compared to what we are doing here. Specifically with WBO6, that beer is going to be almost Saison dry. It's a diastatic positive strain. Would not recommend using it for a Hefeweizen. There are a couple alternate versions of Hefeweizen strains known as the American Hefeweizen or the American wheat strain. These are gonna be a lot less characterful, but they're still gonna have similar characteristics. So if you want the wheat beer flavors, but without as much of the extreme characterfulness of the German wheats, then that is an option to use the American Hefeweizen strains. All right, so the fermentation for the beer went really well. It was about 12 days long before we hit our final gravity of 1013. That was right on the money. Now I did have some family coming over shortly after this, so I did actually keg off a very small portion, about 1.5 gallons into a very small keg. And I had that upstairs, force carbonated it, served it off the tap. It was great, delicious beer, but it was certainly missing something. And what it was missing was that little bit of yeast contribution flavor that you get from bottle conditioning. So the remaining 4 gallons or so of this beer are going to go into bottles. Now, Brewer's Friend's carbonation calculator is telling me I need about 4.3 grams of table sugar, and that's what I'll be using to carbonate, per half-liter bottle to get us the requisite 3.0 volumes of CO2 for this beer. So this time I made a simple syrup out of equal parts by weight, water, and table sugar, so that it's fully dissolved. So we'll add about 8 grams of the simple syrup into each individual half-liter bottle. So now we'll talk through and walk through the bottle conditioning process. Instead of putting everything into a bottling bucket where it's vulnerable to oxidation, I've gone ahead and transferred everything from the fermenter into a 5-gallon keg, which has been purged with CO2. I also added in a small amount of ascorbic acid as an oxygen scrubber. That's kind of just cheap insurance to help prevent any oxidation that might occur during the transfer and bottle conditioning process. There is a little bit more than like 3.5 gallons in this one, so there is a little excess in there. I'm not 100% certain of the full volume that we have to bottle today, which is why I am priming each individual bottle to the same level. So the process I'm going to be using to do the bottle conditioning here is pretty simple, straightforward. I'm just going to use some external CO2 to push the beer out of the 5-gallon keg that's in right now through a bottling wand into 500 milliliter bottles. We're going to leave the capped bottles with the priming sugar solution in them, in their cases, at about 75 degrees, and I'm actually going to do that in my fermentation chamber here. One more thing to note, kind of a safety thing. These are specially designed for high carbonation beers, like we're going to be doing for this Hefeweizen. These are 500 milliliter Belgian style bottles that can handle, I think, like 4 or 5 volumes of CO2. We're not obviously going that high, but the point is your standard 12-ounce brown bottle that you get with any standard beer and you want to reuse it or whatever, that or your typical basic homebrew bottle is not designed to handle high pressure like that. So don't use those if you're going to be bottle conditioning to 3 volumes of CO2. So I've sanitized the bottling wand and the tubing by running some CO2 and some sanitizer through that. Now we're going to sanitize the bottles themselves. The bottle's been sanitized. I've emptied the sanitizer. We're now going to fill the bottle from the bottom up with beer. And that's about right for headspace. And then I'm going to add 8 grams of simple syrup to it. And I'll measure that out by weight using this little scale, and then sanitize the cap, and we'll go ahead and cap it with the benchtop capper, and there we go. So now the residual yeast should carbonate that up in a few weeks.
The beer is called Königsbier, and it comes in at 5.5% ABV and 12 IBUs. For the appearance of the beer, it's pouring a really nice, I think true to style, pale yellow color with a considerable amount of haze, of course, but not so much that it's opaque or thick or milky, kind of like a hazy IPA would be. And one thing to note here, I'm going to show you the right thing to do when you're pouring a bottled Hefeweizen, and that is to rouse the yeast from the bottom of the bottle by swirling up the last little bit and then pouring it directly on top. This infuses the yeast into the beer, giving you that quintessential Hefeweizen flavor, which can be missing from kegged versions. It also really helps to build up some of that extra head. The head on the beer is phenomenal. It sticks around forever. The structured head like that is one of the key elements of this beer, and it takes, no joke, about 10 minutes to drop.
All right, let's go in now for aroma. Aroma on this one, it's pretty classic banana clove combo. A little bit more on the clove, on the aroma. So a little bit more of the phenolics coming through, more of the 4VG. And then there's definitely a good concentrated graininess from the wheat. Smells a little sweet, actually. Smells a little bit, now the banana's coming through, I guess, more. I don't know, depends on what part of my face I stick in the glass, I guess. No, it smells right on point, you know, no complaints there. All right, so now let's go in for a mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this one is awesome. It is so soft and fluffy, creamy. It definitely's got like a little bit of a fluffiness to it. If the carbonation calculator is to be trusted, I'm looking at something like 3.2 volumes of CO2 on this. Yet that does not take away from the fluffiness or the creaminess in this. Light-bodied, very easy drinker. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. Let's talk about the flavor. The first thing I'm getting is a nice note of esters in there. So the isoamyl acetate, the banana flavor, comes through first, and then right after that, you're getting a really solid amount of 4VG, the phenolics coming through. I feel like between the two flavors, the balance on it does favor the 4VG ever so slightly, a little bit more clove than banana there. And then a very nice finish with a little bit of like a floral character. There is some vanilla in there now too. It's coming through a little bit more now. There's some other kind of hard to describe phenolic flavors in this that are not clove. There's a piece of it that feels a little bit less clove, a little bit more like herbal. And I don't think that's hops because I didn't add any late boil hops. There's definitely a pronounced wheat flavor too, especially in the exhale. Really get a lot of that nice kind of wheat cereal-y kind of flavor. Now this beer sat in the bottle for about a week before it was fully carbonated, but even then it's been 3 weeks since that point. So the beer's been in the bottle for about 4 weeks, and it's really hitting its stride now because it's really starting to showcase more of the banana. Early on in its life cycle, this was definitely a lot less balanced. It was a lot more favoring the clove. Now that it's aged a little bit, some of that banana's coming out a bit more. All right, let's start to wrap things up here. I want to talk quickly about a couple things. First of all, potential improvements on this one. Even if it's the same strain, every version of a particular strain of yeast is going to have slight little nuances to it that cause it to be slightly different. And Hefeweizen yeast, of course, is no exception to that. And here, I think reasonably so, I could have probably gotten away with a little higher fermentation temperature. The beer that came out of this is great, and I'm happy with the balance. It's very classic German style Hefeweizen in that it's not a banana bomb. It's got both banana and clove in pretty equal quantities overall. However, for my palate, I think I would have liked to see a little bit more banana in here. That assessment is pretty consistent with the other Hefeweizen brews that I've done on this channel. Pretty much all of them have not really been the level of banana that I want. So I think what I need to start doing there is trying to either coax out a little bit more of that by underpitching more, or potentially pushing that fermentation temperature even further. So realistically, I think a potential improvement here might be to start that fermentation a lot less cold. Maybe starting it at like 68 to 70 degrees, or even maybe higher than that. We'll see. The ferulic acid rest provides more than enough nice, satisfying clove flavor in this. And also considering that every single Hefeweizen yeast is going to be slightly different, and this is certainly no exception, even if it's the same strain from different manufacturers, they're all going to behave a little differently. So with this particular one, definitely would recommend pushing that fermentation temperature up a little higher, a little earlier. And that should give us more of the banana, more of the vanilla, and that I think would really solidify the flavor that I'm looking for. It's a simple recipe, and honestly, it's an easy beer to brew, but it's a difficult beer to perfect. And it's also a difficult beer to consistently do the same thing on. I think that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful, learned something, and if you did, feel free to hit that like button. It does help my channel out quite a bit. And subscribe as well if you haven't already. And don't forget to comment down below as well if you got any thoughts or opinions on the brew day or on the beer, the recipe, anything really. I do enjoy reading those. If you want to help support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this one. You can find this design and plenty of others in the merchandise store, which is linked down below the video in the description box. There's also some glassware and other things on that store that could be fun. Also linked in the description box is my Patreon. And my patrons are the #1 financial resource for this channel. You guys are helping fund the production quality changes that take place over time. You're helping pay for business expenses that pile up. And you're helping me to be able to do things that I otherwise would not have been able to do without your support, all of which goes into this channel's content production. So I really do appreciate what you're doing. Thank you very, very much for your support. If Patreon is not your thing though, I also have channel memberships and there's the super thanks button, both of which are quick and easy ways to help support me. All of that stuff goes right back into the channel as well, and it means a lot to me. I also have an Amazon store in the description box where you can find not only the channel production equipment, but also a lot of the brewing equipment that I use on the regular. If it's on Amazon, it's gonna be on that store, so do check that out. I get a small kickback from that. It's no additional cost to you, so it's another easy way to help support me. I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook as the Apartment Brewer, so check those links out for some more frequent content updates if you want to check out what's coming to the channel and see some other random stuff. It's a fun way to kind of keep up with what's going on in my life. And last but certainly not least, guys, if you are still here, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It means a lot to me. I really do appreciate it because it tells me that you enjoyed what you're seeing here, and it tells me to keep doing it. So if you're still watching at this point, this one goes out to you. And I will catch you all in the next one. So until then, Prost.